He dragged her out in front of glass and witnesses. The revolving doors of Blake Technologies spun behind them as Cameron Blake yanked Serenity Vale forward. Her wheelchair left, skewed against the curb. Morning traffic slowed. Employees froze. No one stepped in. "You don't belong here anymore," he said loud enough for the lobby, for the cameras, for everyone. Serenity didn't argue. She didn't reach for the chair. She only looked at him, calm still, as if she already knew how this would end. What Cameron didn't know, what no one there knew, was that the building he stood in no longer belonged to him. If you believe dignity matters more than power, stay with this story. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and your local time. I want to see how far this moment travels. And if stories about quiet strength and justice resonate with you, consider subscribing. Some truths don't need to shout to be heard. Before the silence, before the distance, before the careful documentation of every word and omission, there had been a version of their life that others admired without question. Serenity Vale had not entered Cameron Blake's world by accident. She had been raised in rooms where numbers decided futures. The Vale family name carried quiet weight in financial circles, not loud, not ostentatious, but enduring. Their firm, Vale Capital, did not chase attention. It shaped outcomes. Serenity grew up understanding structures, how ownership could be layered, how influence could be hidden behind signatures that never appeared in public filings. She learned early that control rarely announced itself. When she met Cameron, he had none of that. He had energy, vision, a kind of ambition that moved too quickly to recognize its own fragility. Blake Technologies at the time was not yet a company people respected. It was an idea, half-built, underfunded, and dangerously dependent on belief. They met at a small investor event in Boston. Cameron had been speaking too fast, overselling projections, trying to convince a room that had already decided not to believe him. Serenity had been seated in the second row, listening without interrupting, watching not what he said, but how he reacted when people stopped listening. He didn't retreat. He pushed harder. After the presentation, while others filtered out politely, Serenity approached him with a single question. "How much of your projection assumes capital you don't have?" Cameron didn't answer immediately. Most people would have deflected. He didn't. Enough that I won't survive 6 months without it. It wasn't confidence. It was honesty under pressure. Serenity noticed. What followed was not romance, not at first. It was strategy. She introduced him to 2 investors, not the obvious ones, but the ones who valued long-term structure over short-term gain. She reviewed his financial model, correcting assumptions he hadn't realized were flawed. She didn't take credit publicly. She didn't need to. Within a year, Blake Technologies had its first major funding round. Within 2, Cameron was being invited to speak at conferences he once couldn't attend. And somewhere in between, the relationship shifted. He began to look for her in rooms. She began to stay longer after meetings. There was a moment quiet, unremarkable to anyone else, when Cameron reached for her hand across a table cluttered with contracts and laptops. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They married 6 months later. To the public, they became something easy to define, a power couple. The founder and the woman who stood beside him. The narrative was simple, clean, and incomplete. What no one saw was how often Serenity stepped back so Cameron could stand forward. She declined interviews, redirected credit, allowed articles to describe her as supportive instead of structural. It was easier that way, cleaner. Control, she knew, was more stable when it wasn't contested. For a while, Cameron understood that. There had been evenings when he would come home exhausted, dropping his keys on the kitchen counter, loosening his tie with one hand, while asking her what she thought of a decision he hadn't finalized. Not because he needed validation, because he trusted her judgment. "You see angles I miss," he had told her once, leaning against the doorway while she reviewed a draft contract. "I don't know how you do that." Serenity hadn't looked up when she answered. "I don't move as fast as you." It had sounded like a joke. It wasn't. The accident happened on a late autumn evening. Rain had made the road slick, visibility low. Serenity had been returning from a private meeting one Cameron hadn't attended, one he hadn't asked about. The other driver never saw the red light. Impact didn't announce itself either. It arrived abrupt and irreversible. When Serenity woke in the hospital, the first thing she noticed was not the pain. It was the stillness. Her body did not respond the way it once had. Signals failed where they should have flowed. The diagnosis came carefully delivered in measured language by specialists who had done this before. Spinal trauma. Permanent loss of mobility below the waist. Words designed to be clinical to remove emotion from consequence. Cameron had been there when they explained it. At first, he stayed close. He adjusted his schedule, took calls from hospital corridors, sat beside her bed with a focus that resembled devotion. He reassured her in ways that sounded convincing even to himself. "We'll figure this out," he said. Nothing changes. For a while, he believed that. But belief Serenity understood is often strongest before reality settles in. Recovery was not a single moment. It was a series of small, quiet adjustments. Learning new limits, accepting altered routines, understanding that independence would now require different forms of control. Serenity adapted faster than anyone expected. She learned the mechanics of her chair with precision, adjusted her environment, reconstructed her day around efficiency rather than frustration. She did not ask for sympathy. What she observed instead was Cameron. At first, the changes were subtle. A hesitation before helping her. A slight delay in response when she called his name from another room. Meetings that extended longer than necessary. Calls taken outside. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that could be pointed to as a single moment of failure. But patterns Serenity knew reveal themselves over time. He stopped asking her opinion as often. Stopped bringing contracts home. Stopped including her in conversations that once felt automatic. When he did speak about work, it was summarized, reduced, simplified, as if complexity was no longer something she needed. "You don't need to worry about this," he told her one evening, scrolling through his phone while she sat across from him. "I've got it handled." It wasn't the words. It was the assumption behind them. Serenity didn't correct him. She didn't remind him of the early days of the structure she had built of the investors who still answered her calls before his. She simply listened and began quietly to take note. Not in anger, not in immediate reaction, in observation. She kept records not because she expected to use them, but because information once lost cannot be recovered. Dates, conversations, changes in tone, decisions made without consultation. Cameron didn't notice. He moved faster now, as if speed could replace what had once been shared. The distance between them did not arrive all at once. It unfolded gradually disguised as adaptation. To the outside world, nothing appeared broken. Blake Technologies continued to grow. Cameron's reputation expanded. Their marriage in photographs and brief public appearances remained intact. But inside their home, silence began to take shape, not as absence, but as space. Space where trust had once been assumed. Space where partnership had once existed. Serenity did not fill that space with confrontation. She allowed it to remain. Because she understood something Cameron had started to forget. What is not said is often more important than what is. And in that silence, something began to form, not impulsive, not emotional, but deliberate. She didn't know yet what shape it would take, only that she would be ready when it did. Change when it mattered most rarely arrived as a single event. It unfolded in small permissions. The first meeting Serenity was not invited to had a reasonable explanation. "It's just a quick strategy session," Cameron had said, adjusting his cufflinks in the hallway mirror. Nothing formal. Serenity had been at the dining table reviewing a document he had left open the night before. She didn't look up immediately when he spoke. "Strategy tends to become formal," she replied. Cameron smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You don't need to sit through all of it. I'll fill you in later." He didn't. That Serenity noted was the detail that mattered. Not the absence, but the absence of follow-through. The second meeting came a week later, then another, then a series of them scheduled earlier in the morning or extended later into the evening, all was just outside the rhythm of what had once been shared. At Blake Technologies, no one questioned it. The company had grown, structures changed, leadership evolved. That was the explanation offered. And it was convincing if one hadn't been present at the beginning. New hires came in waves, drawn by the company's rising valuation and Cameron's increasingly visible reputation. They knew him as the founder, the face, the one whose name appeared in articles and interviews. Serenity's name did not appear at all. Not because it had been removed, because it had never been placed there. To them, she was an absence with no history. Occasionally, someone would see her in the building, quiet, composed, moving through the space with deliberate control. They might assume she was a spouse visiting or a board member without operational involvement. No one asked. Serenity preferred it that way. Observation is easier when expectation is low. It was during one of those unremarkable afternoons that Vanessa Cross first entered the pattern. She arrived without announcement, though her credentials were clear. A new PR director brought in to refine brand positioning as the company prepared for a broader market expansion. Vanessa was precise in her presentation, confident without appearing aggressive, polished without seeming artificial. She understood visibility, not just how to create it, but how to control it. Cameron noticed immediately. Serenity noticed something else. Vanessa did not speak more than necessary in meetings. She listened first, then positioned her input exactly where it would be most effective. She didn't challenge Cameron directly. She aligned with him strategically. Agreement, Serenity knew, can be more influential than opposition. Within weeks, Vanessa's presence expanded beyond her title. She began attending meetings that were not strictly related to PR. Strategy discussions, investor briefings, internal restructuring conversations. No one objected. Cameron justified it easily. She needs to understand the full picture, he told a senior manager. Brand isn't separate from direction. The logic held. What it didn't explain was the shift in proximity. Vanessa was present more often than necessary, standing closer than required, speaking with Cameron in tones that suggested familiarity beyond professional boundaries. Serenity did not react to this. Reaction, she understood, often reveals more than it conceals. Instead, she watched. There were small details. The way Cameron's schedule adjusted meetings clustered around Vanessa's availability. Late-night emails sent not just to teams, but directly between the two of them. A pattern of internal messages marked urgent that did not appear in official summaries. Serenity still had access to certain systems, not all, but enough. Permissions once granted are not always revoked with precision. She didn't search immediately. She waited, because patterns become clearer over time. When she did begin to review internal communications, she did so without urgency. Email threads first filtered by timestamps, not content. She wasn't looking for a single message. She was looking for rhythm. There it was, consistency. Messages sent late in the evening. Not inappropriate in wording, not explicit, but unnecessary in frequency. Clarifications that could have waited until morning. Follow-ups that repeated what had already been decided. Communication extended beyond function. Serenity saved copies. Not because they proved anything definitive, but because accumulation creates context. Financial reports were next. At first glance, nothing appeared unusual. Revenue growth remained strong. Expenses aligned with expansion. But Serenity had been trained to read beyond summaries. She examined line items, cross-referenced allocations, looked for repetition where there should have been variation. That's where she found it. A series of payments categorized under external consulting. The amounts were not excessive individually, but they repeated, structured in a way that avoided immediate scrutiny. Different vendors, similar patterns. She traced one, then another, then a third. Each led to an entity that did not maintain a visible operational presence. No offices, no clear staff, just registrations. Layered ownership. It wasn't proof of misconduct, not yet. But it was a deviation. Serenity documented everything. Dates, transaction IDs, associated accounts. She didn't confront Cameron. Confrontation at this stage would have achieved nothing. He would have explained. And explanations when given early tend to close doors rather than open them. Instead, she continued her routine. Present but unobtrusive. Attentive but silent. There was a company event scheduled 2 weeks later, a mid-year investor gathering held at a hotel overlooking the Hudson. Serenity attended. Not because she was expected to, but because absence would have been noted by the few who still remembered her presence. The room was filled with familiar patterns. Investors speaking in measured tones. Executives adjusting narratives depending on who they addressed. Subtle negotiations happening in open spaces. Cameron moved through it all with ease. Confidence now practiced. Vanessa remained close. Not at his side constantly, but within range. Close enough to be included in conversations that extended beyond her role. Serenity positioned herself near the edge of the room. Visibility without prominence. From there, she observed. There was a moment, brief but clear, when Cameron introduced Vanessa to a group of investors. "This is Vanessa Cross," he said. "She's been instrumental in shaping where we're headed next." Instrumental. The word carried weight. It replaced something. Serenity didn't react outwardly, but she noted it. Not because of what it meant publicly, because of what it revealed privately. Cameron no longer saw the distinction between foundation and appearance, between what built the company and what presented it. Later that evening, as the event began to wind down, Serenity overheard a fragment of conversation, not directed at her, not meant for her. Two junior employees standing near the exit. "I thought his wife was involved in the company," one said. The other shrugged. "Maybe before. I've never seen her in meetings." "That's strange. Things change." Serenity didn't correct them. She didn't need to. Because they were right. Things had changed, just not in the way they assumed. As she left the venue, the city lights reflecting off the river in steady patterns, Serenity understood that the shift was no longer subtle. It had taken form. Not as a single betrayal, but as a structure built gradually piece by piece, unnoticed by those inside it. Except her. And she was no longer just observing. She was beginning to understand exactly where to look next. The first clear fracture did not come with raised voices or undeniable proof. It came in the form of a number that didn't belong where it appeared. Serenity found it late in the evening, long after Cameron had gone to bed. The house was quiet, in the way large spaces often are sound, absorbed into distance movement, reduced to intention. She had positioned herself near the window in the study, her laptop open, a soft glow reflecting against the glass. She wasn't searching for anything specific. That was important. Searching creates bias. It narrows perception. Serenity preferred to let the data speak before deciding what it meant. The financial system still recognized her credentials, though in a diminished capacity. She no longer had full administrative control, but fragments remained access pathways that had not been fully revoked permissions, overlooked in the assumption that she would no longer use them. Assumptions, she knew, were often more dangerous than actions. She began with quarterly summaries. Revenue lines were stable. Growth projections aligned with public reports. Expenses appeared within expected margins for a company expanding at Blake Technology's current rate. Nothing obvious. So she moved deeper. Line items, subcategories, disbursement records. That's where the number appeared. $2.8 million. Categorized under international expansion consulting. Not unusual in isolation. Expansion required advisors, legal structuring, local expertise. But Serenity paused not because of the amount, but because of the structure surrounding it. The payment had been split. 3 transfers, each just under a reporting threshold that would trigger automatic internal review. Different dates, different vendor names. But the formatting, accounting codes, timing intervals, routing sequences followed a pattern. It was precise, too precise to be incidental. Serenity didn't react. She zoomed out first. Patterns require context. She scanned previous quarters, tracing similar categories. Smaller amounts appeared less noticeable, less structured, but consistent in direction. Each time, the funds exited toward entities that shared one characteristic: opacity. No operational footprint. No recognizable partnerships. Minimal digital presence. Companies that existed but did not function in any observable way. She selected one: Aurora Strategic Holdings LLC. The name suggested scale. The registration suggested otherwise. Delaware filing, recently established. No public-facing operations. No listed employees beyond a registered agent. Serenity traced the payment route from Blake Technologies to an intermediary account, from the intermediary to Aurora. From Aurora, nothing visible. A dead end or a deliberate stop. She documented everything. Transaction IDs, timestamps, routing paths, not as accusation, as record. There was a difference. The next morning, Cameron mentioned the expansion casually over breakfast. "We're moving faster into European markets," he said, scrolling through his phone between bites. "There are a lot of moving parts." Serenity poured her tea slowly. "Consulting must be expensive," she said. Cameron didn't look up immediately. "It is," he replied, "but necessary. No elaboration, no specifics." Serenity nodded once, as if the answer had been sufficient. She didn't ask about Aurora. Not yet. Because questions, when asked too early, alert the wrong people. Instead, she shifted the conversation. "Which markets are you prioritizing?" "Germany first," Cameron said. "Then maybe the Netherlands." Serenity took note. Later that day, she accessed the records again. There were no consulting agreements linked to Germany. No legal filings, no preliminary groundwork. The funds categorized under expansion had no corresponding operational trail. That was the first red flag. Not proof of wrongdoing, but evidence of misalignment between stated intent and recorded action. Serenity did not confront Cameron. Confrontation requires clarity. And clarity at this stage was still forming. Instead, she reached out to someone who had been part of her world long before Cameron entered it. Daniel Mercer. He had been her family's legal advisor for over 2 decades. Not visible, not public, but precise in ways that mattered. He understood structures. More importantly, he understood discretion. Their conversation took place over a secure line. Serenity, Daniel said, his tone measured as always. "It's been a while." "Yes," she replied. "I need you to look at something." She didn't describe it emotionally. She presented facts, transaction patterns, entity names, timing sequences. Daniel didn't interrupt. When she finished, there was a brief pause. "Do you believe this is misallocation?" he asked, "or concealment?" Serenity considered the distinction. "Not enough information to conclude," she said, "but enough to continue." Daniel exhaled quietly. "I'll begin a preliminary review." Quietly, "Only preliminary," Serenity added. "No action yet. Understood." She ended the call without further discussion. Control, she knew, depended on timing. That evening, Cameron returned home later than usual. There was a different energy about him, not stress, but distraction. His attention moved quickly between tasks, never settling. He greeted her, but without focus. "How was your day?" he asked, already halfway through removing his jacket. "Productive," Serenity replied. He nodded, not asking for detail. They sat for dinner in near silence. At one point, Cameron's phone lit up on the table. A message preview appeared briefly before he turned the screen over. Serenity didn't need to read the content. The name was enough. Vanessa Cross. Cameron noticed her glance. "It's work," he said too quickly. Serenity met his eyes for a moment. "I assumed it was." She returned to her meal. No accusation, no curiosity expressed, only acknowledgement. Cameron relaxed slightly, interpreting her response as acceptance. That too was noted. After dinner, as Cameron moved into his office to take a call, Serenity remained in the dining room. Still, listening not to words but to tone. Through the partially closed door, fragments of conversation reached her. "No, keep it separate. We'll handle it through the usual channels. It doesn't need to be visible yet." The words were incomplete, but they aligned. Not with what Cameron had said, with what the numbers suggested. Serenity didn't move closer. She didn't need to hear everything. Enough had already been revealed. Later that night, she returned to the study. The city beyond the window was quieting lights dimming in uneven patterns. She opened a new document. Not a journal, not a narrative. A ledger of observations, date, time, event, evidence. She entered the transaction details first. Then the conversation fragments. Then the discrepancies between stated expansion plans and recorded financial activity. Each entry was precise, neutral in tone, free of interpretation, because interpretation could come later. Facts needed to stand on their own. When she finished, she reviewed the document once, then saved it, not on the primary system, not anywhere Cameron might access, but within a secured structure layered beneath accounts that no longer bore her active name. Precautions, she knew, were not signs of distrust. They were acknowledgments of reality. As she closed the laptop, Serenity allowed herself a brief moment, not of doubt, but of recognition. The situation had shifted. From observation to confirmation of inconsistency. From uncertainty to direction. She still did not know the full extent of what Cameron was doing. But she knew enough to understand this. The story he was telling did not match the one being written in numbers. And numbers, unlike words, rarely lied without leaving a trace. Serenity did not feel anger, not yet. What she felt was clarity beginning to take shape. Slow, deliberate, unavoidable. And once fully formed, it would not require confrontation to assert itself. It would simply exist. And everything built on false assumptions would have to adjust around it. Serenity did not change her behavior after the first red flag. That was the strategy. Not because she lacked reaction, but because reaction would have altered the environment too early. Cameron was still moving freely within a structure he believed was intact. Interrupting that illusion would force him to adjust to conceal more carefully to close access points that were still for now open. So Serenity chose stillness. From the outside, nothing about her seemed different. She maintained the same routines. Breakfast at the same hour, occasional presence in shared spaces. The same quiet tone when she spoke, the same measured responses when Cameron addressed her. If anything, she allowed herself to appear slightly more withdrawn. Not absent, just diminished. It was a role Cameron had already begun to assign to her. She simply accepted it. And in doing so, she removed herself as a variable in his calculations. Cameron responded to that shift almost immediately, though he didn't recognize it as such. Without resistance, without questions, his behavior expanded. He stayed out later without explanation. He stopped offering even the minimal summaries he once gave. Decisions that had previously been discussed briefly but acknowledged were now made entirely outside her awareness. He assumed she no longer needed to know, or worse, that she could no longer understand. Serenity documented the change not emotionally but structurally. Before, partial inclusion. Now none. It wasn't the exclusion itself that mattered. It was the confidence with which it was carried out. Confidence suggests belief. Belief suggests assumption. And assumptions, when left unchallenged, grow. Vanessa Cross became more visible during this period, not just within the company, but within Cameron's personal orbit. Her name appeared more frequently in conversations, though always framed within professional context. Vanessa handled the press call. Vanessa restructured the messaging. Vanessa thinks we should position this differently. The phrasing was consistent. Attribution without explanation. Serenity noted the frequency, not the content. Frequency reveals priority. One evening, Cameron mentioned a company dinner. Just a small group, he said, adjusting his watch. Leadership team. Serenity nodded. You should go, she replied. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, long enough for her to register. "You don't want to come?" he asked. It was not an invitation. It was a formality. Serenity met his gaze evenly. "I wouldn't be comfortable in that setting right now." It was a plausible answer, not entirely true, but useful. Cameron accepted it without question. "All right," he said. "I'll be back late." He didn't specify how late. He didn't need to. After he left, Serenity moved through the house without urgency. She wasn't waiting. Waiting implies uncertainty. She was continuing. In the study, she accessed the system again. This time, she expanded her scope. Not just financial records, but internal communications, scheduling logs, access histories. Patterns began to align. Meetings labeled under general categories that consistently included the same participants. Cameron, Vanessa, 2 others from finance. Repeated. Private calendar entries that did not appear on official schedules. Encrypted attachments exchanged outside standard documentation channels. Serenity didn't attempt to open everything. Accessing too much too quickly increases visibility. Instead, she selected samples, enough to establish direction. Then she stopped. Controls she knew required restraint. The next step was not more data. It was preservation. She began exporting records. Carefully, fragmented, never in bulk. Each file saved under neutral naming conventions, routed through layers that separated them from the original system. No single action would trigger attention. No single transfer would appear unusual. Accumulation done slowly becomes invisible. Over the following days, Serenity expanded her documentation. Emails first. Threads that demonstrated continuity. Not isolated messages, but sequences. Then financial records, cross-referenced with timestamps from communications. Aligning decisions with movements of money. Then audio. Not through intrusion, through presence. Cameron had grown careless in shared spaces. Conversations taken on speakerphone. Discussions held within hearing range, assuming disengagement from the person in the room. Serenity did not move closer. She did not make her listening visible. She simply remained and recorded what was already being offered. Not everything, just enough. Enough to confirm patterns, enough to establish intent. One evening, as Cameron spoke in the living room, his tone lower than usual, Serenity sat nearby with a book open in her lap. "It's structured," he said. "There's no direct link." A pause. No, she's not involved anymore. Another pause. "It's clean." Serenity turned a page. Slowly, not reacting, not looking up. But every word was noted. Later that night, she added the conversation to her record. Date, time, context, exact phrasing, not interpretation, facts. As the documentation grew, so did clarity. Not complete, but sufficient. What Cameron was doing was no longer a possibility. It was a structure, deliberate, maintained, and importantly dependent on the assumption that no one was observing it fully. Serenity did not challenge that assumption. She reinforced it. Her interactions with Cameron became simpler, shorter, more accommodating. If he dismissed a topic, she let it go. If he redirected a conversation, she followed. If he overlooked her presence, she did not correct him. Each response reduced her perceived relevance. Each reduction increased his exposure. Vanessa's presence crossed another threshold during this time. She began appearing in spaces that were no longer strictly professional. Phone calls late at night, messages during weekends, references to shared decisions that extended beyond company matters. Cameron did not hide it carefully, because he believed there was nothing to hide, or that it no longer mattered. Serenity did not categorize it as betrayal. Not yet, because emotion would have narrowed her focus, and her focus needed to remain wide. The situation was not about one relationship. It was about structure, control, movement of assets, alignment of decisions. Everything else was secondary. One afternoon, as Serenity reviewed a set of bank records Daniel Mercer had begun to analyze quietly, she saw the pattern extend beyond what she had initially identified. The offshore accounts were not isolated. They connected. Layered entities feeding into each other, creating distance between origin and destination. It was sophisticated, but not invisible. Daniel's message was brief. This is intentional. No elaboration, none was needed. Serenity read it once, then closed the file. She didn't respond immediately, because response was not required, understanding was. And she understood enough now to recognize the scale. This was not mismanagement. It was redirection. Funds moving away from the company under the appearance of legitimate expense, positioned in a way that, if unchallenged, would remain undetected. But it had been detected. Not publicly, not formally, but completely enough. Serenity leaned back slightly in her chair, her gaze settling not on the screen, but beyond it. The next phase would require movement, not observation, not documentation, action, but not yet. Timing, as always, would determine outcome. Cameron still believed the environment was stable. That belief was still useful, so Serenity allowed it to continue, for now. Because silence, when used correctly, is not absence. It is preparation. And what she was preparing would not require raised voices. It would not depend on confrontation. It would unfold with the same precision Cameron believed he had mastered. Only this time, he would not see it coming. The shift from observation to action did not announce itself. It began with a call placed at an hour when most transactions had already settled for the day. Serenity did not choose the timing randomly. Late afternoon on the East Coast meant early evening in London, mid-morning in California. And more importantly, a window when overlapping markets created just enough noise to conceal movement without drawing attention. She dialed a number she hadn't used in years. The line connected on the second ring. Vale Capital, a voice answered, steady professional. Serenity didn't introduce herself immediately. Is Andrew Halpern available? A brief pause. And who's calling? Tell him it's Serenity. The response changed. Please hold. It took less than 10 seconds. Serenity, Andrew said, his tone shifting from formal to precise recognition. I wasn't expecting your call. I know, she replied. I need a structure. Andrew didn't ask what kind. He understood the language. Scope acquisition, she said. Gradual, controlled, no visibility tied to my name. Another pause, but not hesitation. Calculation. Target Blake Technologies. Silence followed. Not surprise. Assessment. That's significant, Andrew said finally. Yes. Does anyone else know? No. Andrew exhaled quietly. Then we'll keep it that way. Serenity leaned back slightly, her gaze steady. I want layered entities. Domestic and offshore. No direct linkage. Incremental accumulation. Andrew's voice sharpened, fully engaged now. Timeline. As long as it takes to avoid detection. Majority control, yes. There was no discussion of why. Andrew didn't ask, because in their world, reasons were less important than execution. I'll assemble a team, he said. Discreet. No internal chatter. Only people who understand containment, Serenity added. Of course. The call ended without formality. No closing remarks, no reassurances. Just alignment. That was how Vale Capital operated. Within 48 hours, the structure began to take shape. It did not exist in a single place. It was distributed. A series of LLCs registered across multiple jurisdictions, Delaware, Wyoming, Nevada, each holding minor positions, each appearing independent. Behind them, a parent structure layered through offshore entities, Cayman, Luxembourg, places where ownership could be obscured without raising immediate concern. No single entity held enough to trigger attention. That was the point. Accumulation would happen in fragments, invisible in isolation, significant in total. Serenity did not oversee every detail. She didn't need to. She defined parameters. Andrew executed within them. Updates came in the form of concise summaries. Entity A acquired 1.2%. Entity C secured 0.8% through secondary market. Additional shares available via private seller pending confirmation. Each message was brief. Data without commentary. Serenity read them once. Then archived them. Not in her primary system. Not anywhere Cameron could access. She maintained separation between observation and action. Two parallel structures. One documenting his behavior, one reshaping his environment. Cameron noticed none of it, because he wasn't looking in that direction. His focus remained forward expansion, visibility growth. He spoke more frequently now about scaling. "We're moving faster than expected," he said one evening, pacing the living room while reviewing notes on his tablet. "If this continues, we'll outpace projections by Q3. Serenity sat near the window, her hands resting lightly on the armrests of her chair. "That usually brings scrutiny," she said. Cameron shrugged. "We're clean." The word lingered. Clean. Serenity didn't respond, because she already knew what he meant. Not truth, appearance. And appearance, she understood, was exactly what he was managing. Vanessa Cross became increasingly embedded in that process. Her role expanded beyond communication. She began shaping narratives before they existed, positioning decisions as inevitable outcomes, aligning investor expectations with actions that had already been taken. Serenity observed the efficiency of it. Vanessa didn't create direction. She framed it. And in doing so, she protected Cameron from questions he hadn't anticipated. It was effective, in the short term. But it also created blind spots, because when perception is controlled too tightly, reality begins to drift unnoticed. Serenity continued her role, unchanged, present but peripheral. Cameron had fully adjusted to her silence. He no longer hesitated before excluding her, no longer offered explanations, no longer assumed she required inclusion. That assumption was now complete, and therefore predictable. One afternoon, as Cameron prepared for an investor call, Serenity noticed a detail he overlooked. A document left open on his tablet, not intentionally, just carelessly. It contained a summary of shareholder distribution, outdated, but close enough to current to reveal structure. Serenity didn't move immediately. She waited until he stepped out of the room. Then she glanced once. Only once. Long enough to confirm. The entities Andrew had established were beginning to appear. Not obviously connected, not grouped, but present. Small percentages, scattered, unremarkable, exactly as intended. Serenity returned to her original position before Cameron re-entered the room. He didn't notice, because he wasn't expecting her to look. That evening, Andrew sent another update. Total accumulated 18.4%. It was progressing, not quickly, but steadily, and most importantly, without disruption. Serenity considered the number, then closed the message. There was no urgency, because urgency creates mistakes, and mistakes create visibility. Over the following weeks, the network expanded. New entities introduced. Additional shares acquired through indirect channels. Private agreements executed through intermediaries who had no knowledge of the larger structure. Each transaction isolated. Each step contained. Cameron continued to operate under the assumption of control. He spoke confidently in meetings, made decisions without hesitation, expanded operations without reevaluating internal structure, because in his view, nothing had changed. That was the advantage. Change when unseen is most effective. Vanessa's presence reached another level. She began attending meetings with investors, not as an observer, as a participant. Her influence was now visible. Cameron introduced her without reservation. "She's part of the core team," he said during one call. Core. The word replaced something again. Serenity noted it. Not emotionally, structurally, because language reflects alignment, and alignment determines outcome. One evening, as Serenity reviewed the latest update, 24.7% accumulated, she paused briefly. Not because of the number, because of what it represented. The network was no longer theoretical. It was operational, functioning, growing, and still undetected. She didn't feel satisfaction, not yet. What she felt was confirmation. The plan was working, not because it was aggressive, but because it was patient. Cameron still believed he controlled the company. The board still saw him as majority influence. The market still responded to his decisions. All of that remained true, for now. But underneath that surface, ownership was shifting, quietly, deliberately, irreversibly. Serenity closed the file. The city outside had dimmed into evening lights, reflecting across glass in patterns that didn't change no matter how many times they were observed. She remained still for a moment, not thinking about Cameron, not thinking about Vanessa, only about structure, and how once completed it would not need to announce itself. It would simply exist. And when it did, everything built on outdated assumptions would have to adjust, without warning, without negotiation, without noise, because control, when properly established, does not need to be taken. It is revealed. By the time the company announced its mid-year leadership summit, the shift had already become visible to anyone paying close attention. The problem was, almost no one was. Blake Technologies had grown into a company that rewarded momentum. Growth masked irregularities. Success softened scrutiny. As long as numbers climbed and projections held, few questioned the structure beneath. But behavior, unlike numbers, leaves traces in human memory. And memory, even when dismissed, accumulates. The summit was held at a renovated industrial venue in Brooklyn, glass steel, and deliberate minimalism. It was designed to project forward motion, innovation, control. Serenity arrived early, not because she'd been asked to, because she understood positioning. Timing determined visibility. Entering before the room filled allowed her to observe the space without becoming the center of it. A staff member approached her near the entrance. "Can I help you find your seat?" he asked, polite, uncertain. Serenity met his gaze briefly. "I'll manage," she said. He nodded, stepping aside without further question. He didn't recognize her. That too was noted. Inside the room was already partially arranged. Reserved tables near the front bore name cards, executives, key investors, senior leadership. Serenity moved toward them, not quickly, not hesitantly, just with the same measured pace she used everywhere else. She paused when she saw the placement. Cameron Blake center table, Vanessa Cross adjacent. Other executives aligned accordingly. There was no card for Serenity, not an oversight, a decision. Serenity didn't linger. She turned, navigating toward the rear section where general seating had been arranged. The distance was not dramatic, but it was clear, front, back, defined. She positioned herself at a table near the edge of the room, close enough to observe, far enough to be overlooked. As attendees began to arrive, the space filled with controlled noise conversations, measured in tone. Laughter calibrated for effect introductions, layered with intent. Cameron entered 15 minutes later. He moved with confidence, acknowledging greetings, shaking hands, maintaining a rhythm that suggested familiarity with being observed. Vanessa walked beside him. Not behind, not ahead, beside. They spoke briefly as they crossed the room, their proximity unremarkable to those who had grown accustomed to it. But to those who remembered earlier patterns, it was different. Subtle, but different. Cameron reached the front tables without scanning the room for Serenity. He didn't look, because he no longer expected her to be part of that space. Serenity watched without expression, not because it didn't register, because reaction would serve no purpose. The event began with a series of presentations. Growth metrics, expansion strategies, market positioning. Cameron spoke with practiced ease. His voice carried across the room, confident, controlled, persuasive. Vanessa followed, refining the narrative, framing decisions, translating structure into story. Together they presented cohesion, a unified direction. From the back of the room, Serenity observed something else. Not what they said, how they aligned. Vanessa anticipated Cameron's transitions before he made them. In Odra, Cameron referenced points Vanessa had introduced as if they had always been part of his thinking. It was seamless. Too seamless to be incidental. Partnership, when it shifts, reveals itself in rhythm. And their rhythm had changed. Between sessions, the room opened into smaller conversations. Clusters formed, investors with executives, managers with team leads. Strategic discussions layered over casual tone. Serenity remained where she was. Not isolated, just unengaged. A few employees passed by, glancing in her direction with brief recognition that didn't fully form. Some older staff paused slightly longer, memory trying to reconcile presence with absence. One of them, Michael Trent, an early engineer who had been with the company before its first funding round, approached her table. "Serenity," he said, uncertainty in his voice. She looked up. "Michael." He exhaled a small release of recognition. "I wasn't sure if that was you," he said. "It's been a while." "It has." He hesitated, glancing toward the front of the room. "I didn't see you up there," he said, gesturing lightly. Serenity followed his gaze briefly, then returned her attention to him. "I wasn't assigned a seat." Michael's expression shifted. Not shock, understanding. "That doesn't seem right," he said. Serenity didn't respond. Because correctness wasn't the point. Structure was. Michael nodded slowly, as if accepting something he didn't fully articulate. "Well," he said, "it's good to see you. And you." He lingered for a moment, then returned to his group. The interaction was brief, but it carried weight. Because memory, once reactivated, doesn't disappear again. As the event progressed, the pattern repeated. Serenity remained outside the central flow, not excluded loudly, just consistently. And consistency over time defines reality. Later in the afternoon, a panel discussion brought Cameron and Vanessa back to the front. Questions were directed toward future direction, leadership, long-term vision. At one point, an investor asked, "Who's been the most influential voice behind your strategic growth over the past 2 years?" Cameron didn't hesitate. "Vanessa," he said. The answer came easily, without pause, without qualification. Serenity noted the absence, not of herself, of acknowledgement, because influence once unnamed is often assumed non-existent. Vanessa inclined her head slightly, accepting the recognition. Professional, composed, expected. From the back of the room, Serenity remained still. No reaction, no shift in posture. But the moment was recorded, not in memory alone, in context. After the panel, as the event moved toward its conclusion, Cameron stepped away from the main group, his attention briefly unoccupied. For a moment, his gaze swept across the room. It passed over Serenity, then returned. A flicker of recognition, not immediate, not certain, but present. He approached, not quickly, not slowly, measured, as if unsure whether the interaction was necessary. "Serenity," he said when he reached her table. She looked up. "Cameron." There was a pause, not uncomfortable, just unfilled. "I didn't realize you were coming," he said. It wasn't apology. It was observation. Serenity held his gaze. "You didn't ask." Another pause. Shorter. Cameron shifted slightly. "Well," he said, "it's good that you're here." The words lacked structure. Serenity nodded once. "Your presentation was clear," she said. "Neutral, accurate." Cameron seemed to accept that as sufficient. "I have to get back," he added, gesturing vaguely toward the front. "Of course." He lingered for a fraction of a second, then turned away, returning to where he belonged, or believed he did. Serenity watched him go, not with resentment, not with longing, with clarity. The distance between them was no longer emotional. It was structural, defined by decisions made repeatedly, publicly, quietly, irreversibly. As the event ended and attendees began to leave the room, gradually emptied, Serenity remained seated until movement slowed, until attention shifted elsewhere. Then she moved. Not toward Cameron, not toward the front, toward the exit. As she passed through the space, she felt the subtle weight of observation. Not from everyone, just enough. Those who remembered, those who noticed, those who began to question. Outside, the evening air carried the distant noise of the city. Unchanged, indifferent. Serenity paused briefly before continuing. Not to reflect, but to register. What had once been shared had now been redefined in public space. Not through declaration, through placement. And placement, she knew, could be changed. Not by argument, but by structure. The kind that did not rely on visibility to exist. The kind that, once established, would not need permission to assert itself. Serenity moved forward. The next phase was no longer forming. It was approaching, and this time it would not remain unseen. The decision to initiate the audit was not made in response to a single event. It was made when the pattern became complete. Not fully exposed, not fully understood, but complete enough to act without risk of misdirection. Serenity did not announce it. She did not document it in any system connected to Blake Technologies. She initiated it the same way she had begun everything else, quietly through channels that did not intersect with Cameron's awareness. Daniel Mercer handled the legal framework. The firm he selected was not one that advertised its work. It did not appear in rankings or public case studies. Its reputation existed in private conversations passed between those who required precision more than recognition. Forensic accounting at that level was not about finding errors. It was about reconstructing intent. The team assigned to Serenity's request never contacted her directly. All communication flowed through Daniel, layered, filtered, controlled. Their first report arrived in fragments, not a summary. Raw findings, transaction chains, entity relationships, temporal alignment. Serenity reviewed them in the same way she approached everything else. Without reaction, without assumption, just structure. The initial confirmation was immediate. The entities she had identified, Aurora Strategic Holdings and several others, were not isolated. They were nodes, connected through a network of layered ownership designed to obscure origin. Funds moved from Blake Technologies into intermediary accounts. From there, they were redistributed into shell entities, then consolidated again under structures that on the surface appeared unrelated. But the pattern held, repeated, consistent, intentional. Daniel's note accompanying the first set of findings was brief. "This is not incidental." Serenity didn't respond. She continued reading. The second layer revealed something more precise. The timing of transfers aligned with internal decision points. Board approvals, budget reallocations, strategic announcements. Each movement of money followed a moment of authority, as if decisions made publicly were being mirrored privately. Redirected, not immediately, but with enough delay to avoid correlation unless one was looking for it. Serenity was. She began cross-referencing her own records, emails, meeting timestamps, fragments of conversation. The structure tightened, not just financial, behavioral. Cameron's late-night calls, Vanessa's increasing involvement, private calendar entries, all of it aligned, not perfectly, but consistently. Consistency, she knew, was more valuable than precision, because precision can be explained. Consistency cannot. The third report introduced a detail Serenity had anticipated but not yet confirmed. Personal benefit. Funds once consolidated did not remain dormant. They moved again, into accounts tied indirectly to Cameron. Not in his name, but in structures that benefited him. Real estate acquisitions, investment vehicles, positions that would appreciate independently of Blake Technologies. It was separation, extraction. Daniel's next message carried a different tone. This meets the threshold. He did not specify which threshold. He didn't need to. Legal, regulatory, criminal. The categories overlapped. Serenity closed the file. Not because she was finished, because she had reached a point where more information would not change direction. Only timing. That was when she gave the instruction. "Continue," she told Daniel. But no disclosure. There was a pause on the line. "You're certain?" he asked. "Yes. Serenity, this level of I'm aware." Daniel adjusted his tone. "Then we proceed quietly." "Yes." No escalation. No alert to authorities. No internal confrontation. Not yet. Because exposure at the wrong time reduces control. And control was still forming. Over the following weeks, the audit deepened. The forensic team expanded its scope. Historical data, archived records, deleted communications reconstructed through metadata. Nothing was rushed. Every conclusion supported. Every connection verified. Serenity received updates regularly. Each one added weight, not to her reaction, to her understanding. Vanessa's role became clearer, not as an architect, but as an enabler. Contracts signed under her oversight. PR budgets inflated to justify transfers. Communications framed to align narrative with movement. She was part of the structure, not its origin, but essential to its function. Serenity noted the distinction. Responsibility would follow accordingly. One evening, as she reviewed a particularly dense set of transaction logs, Cameron entered the room without knocking. He paused when he saw her working. "You're still up?" he asked. Serenity closed the laptop halfway, not abruptly, just enough. "Yes. What are you working on?" The question was casual, unfocused. Serenity met his gaze. Personal accounts. It was not untrue. Cameron nodded. "Right." He didn't ask further, because in his perception, her work no longer intersected with his. That assumption remained intact, and therefore useful. He moved to the kitchen, opening cabinets, the sound of glass against wood echoing faintly. Serenity waited until he left the room before reopening the file. No urgency, no shift in pace. Control remained. The next report confirmed what had been forming. A full chain, from Blake Technologies' internal accounts to final asset placement. Unbroken, traceable, legally actionable. Daniel's message this time was direct. "We can proceed." Serenity read it once, then again, not because she doubted it, because she was aligning timing. Proceeding now would achieve one outcome. Proceeding later would achieve another. The difference was not in legality. It was in structure. She closed the message without replying. For now. Because there was one more element required. Ownership. Without it, action would rely on external authority. With it, action would be internal, controlled, final. The audit had done its function. It had revealed, documented, confirmed. Now it would wait, contained within layers that ensured its existence without exposure. Serenity stored the files across multiple secure locations. Redundancy, separation, no single point of failure, no single access point. If one path was compromised, others remained. Precaution was not optional. It was foundational. As she finished organizing the final set of documents, Serenity allowed herself a brief moment, not of reflection, but of assessment. The structure Cameron had built, hidden, complex, carefully layered, was complete, but so was hers. Parallel, invisible, more stable. Because it did not rely on concealment. It relied on timing. And timing, once aligned with evidence and ownership, would not require force. It would require only revelation. Serenity closed the last file. The room was quiet, the house unchanged. Nothing visible had shifted, and yet everything had. Because the truth now existed in full, documented, verified, ready. All that remained was deciding when to let it be seen. The final acquisition did not feel dramatic. There was no announcement, no visible shift in the rhythm of the day, no moment that marked itself as irreversible to anyone outside the structure that had been quietly forming. It arrived as a confirmation. At 9:12 a.m., Serenity received an encrypted message from Daniel Mercer. Threshold reached. No elaboration. None was necessary. Serenity opened the attached file. A summary. Clean, precise, final. Total controlled shares 51.3%. Majority ownership, not theoretical, not pending, complete. The layered entities, each one independent in appearance, each one accumulated without drawing attention, had converged into a single outcome. Control. Serenity read the number once, then closed the file. There was no visible reaction, no shift in posture, no pause that would have signaled significance to anyone watching. Because significance, she knew, did not require acknowledgement to exist. It required accuracy, and this was exact. Across the city, Cameron began his day as he always did, unaware. His schedule was full: investor calls, a media briefing, internal strategy discussions. The company was preparing for a new announcement, one that would position Blake Technologies as a dominant player in a sector it had only recently entered. Momentum once again was on his side. He reviewed talking points while his assistant summarized the day ahead. Press call at 10. Board check-in at noon. Vanessa will join for both. Cameron nodded. Good. No hesitation, no deviation. Everything from his perspective remained aligned. At the office, the executive floor moved with its usual efficiency. Emails circulated. Meetings began and ended on schedule. Nothing in the environment suggested that ownership, true ownership, had already shifted. Because ownership, when structured correctly, does not disrupt. It replaces, quietly. Serenity remained at home that morning, not because she was excluded, because she chose to observe from a distance. Distance at this stage preserved clarity. She positioned her laptop on the table beside her, the screen open to a secure dashboard Daniel had provided. Not a live feed. Not a system connected to Blake Technologies. An external structure. One that tracked the aggregated holdings of the entities she now controlled. The numbers did not fluctuate. They had stabilized, finalized. She moved through the data methodically, entity by entity, verifying alignment, confirming that no single share remained outside the structure. No vulnerability, no gap, because control, once declared, could not be partial. It had to be absolute. By mid-morning, Daniel called. It's complete, he said. Yes, Serenity replied. We can formalize at any time. Serenity leaned back slightly. Not yet. A pause. You want to delay? I want to choose the moment. Daniel understood immediately. Understood. Prepare the documentation, she continued. Board notification, legal transfer records, everything required for immediate enforcement. It will be ready. And Daniel, yes, no preliminary signals. Of course. The call ended. Serenity closed the laptop. For a moment she remained still, not reflecting, not reconsidering, only acknowledging that the structure she had built was no longer in motion. It had arrived. Across the river, Cameron entered the glass tower that housed Blake Technologies, with the same confidence he had carried for years. Employees greeted him, some with familiarity, some with distance, all with recognition. He moved through the lobby without hesitation, his attention already shifting toward the day's priorities. Vanessa was waiting near the elevators. You're late, she said lightly. Traffic, Cameron replied. She smiled. We're already ahead. They stepped into the elevator together. No one questioned their proximity, because by now it had become normal. Inside the conference room, the first meeting began. Investors joined via video. Updates were delivered, projections discussed. Cameron spoke with authority, because as far as he knew, nothing had changed. And authority, when unchallenged, reinforces itself. One investor asked about shareholder stability. Any recent shifts we should be aware of? Cameron didn't hesitate. Nothing material, he said. The answer was accurate. From his perspective, the shifts had not been visible. Therefore, they did not exist. The meeting moved on. Vanessa presented the next segment. Refined, controlled, aligned with the narrative they had been building for months. Serenity, miles away, did not watch the meeting. She didn't need to, because she already understood its outcome. What mattered was not what was being said, but what would happen when it stopped. At noon, Cameron entered the board check-in. A smaller group, more direct, less performance. Here, decisions carried weight. He reviewed operational updates, financial summaries, growth metrics, all consistent, all reinforcing the same conclusion: Blake Technologies was stable, expanding, under control. No one challenged him, because there was no visible reason to. And visibility, once again, determined perception. Serenity spent the afternoon reviewing the final legal documents, transfer confirmations, ownership declarations, board notification drafts, each one precise, each one aligned with regulatory requirements. Nothing rushed, nothing incomplete, because when the moment arrived, there would be no room for correction, only execution. At 3:47 p.m., she received the last confirmation. All entities consolidated, voting rights aligned. She read it once, then archived it. The structure was now singular, no longer fragmented, no longer layered, unified, under her control. Evening approached. The city shifted, lights turning on in patterns that mirrored the day's gradual close. Cameron left the office later than usual, satisfied. The day had gone as expected. Meetings successful, narrative intact, control in his mind unchallenged. He returned home with the same certainty. Serenity was in the living room when he entered. The lights were soft, the space quiet. He paused briefly when he saw her. "Long day," he said. "Yes," Serenity replied. Their eyes met for a moment. Not long, just enough. Cameron moved past her, placing his bag down, loosening his tie. "Tomorrow's going to be bigger," he added. "We're finalizing a few things." Serenity nodded. "I'm sure you are." He didn't register the difference in her tone, because he wasn't listening for it. He never had been. Later that night, as Cameron slept, Serenity returned to the study. The files were all in place, the structure complete, the evidence secured, the ownership confirmed. She opened the final document, the board notification, prepared, waiting. She didn't send it, not yet, because the moment of revelation was not defined by completion. It was defined by impact, and impact required precision. Tomorrow would be different, not because anything would change overnight, but because what had already changed would finally be seen. Serenity closed the document. The room fell back into stillness. Everything was ready. Not for confrontation, not for conflict, for clarity. And when clarity arrived, it would not raise its voice. It would not demand attention. It would simply exist. And everything built on the assumption that Cameron still owned his company would have to adjust. Immediately, irrevocably, without negotiation. Because the day everything changed had already happened. No one else had noticed. Yet, the morning did not begin differently. That was what made it effective. New York moved with its usual precision. Traffic synchronized in impatience. Pedestrians flowing between Signal's glass towers, reflecting a sky that did not change its tone for individual events. Blake Technologies stood as it always had, its facade polished, its entrance calibrated to project control. Nothing in the environment suggested that anything irreversible had already taken place. Serenity arrived at 8:42 a.m., earlier than Cameron, earlier than most of the executive staff. Timing once again was deliberate. Her car pulled to a stop at the curb, the driver stepping out first, moving to open the rear door. The wheelchair was already positioned, aligned with practiced efficiency. Serenity did not rush the transition. She never did. Movement, when controlled, did not require speed. As she settled into the chair, the morning air carried the distant hum of the city. A few employees passed by, their attention momentarily drawn, then redirected. Recognition flickered in, some faces not fully formed, not entirely certain. Serenity began moving toward the entrance, not toward the side access, not toward a secondary route, toward the main doors. The same doors Cameron used, the same doors he believed defined entry. Inside the lobby, staff maintained their positions. Security near the glass panels, reception at the front desk, a system designed to filter, not question. Serenity crossed the threshold without interruption, because no one had been instructed to stop her. Yet, she positioned herself just inside the revolving doors, not obstructing, not hidden, visible, waiting. Cameron arrived at 8:57 a.m. His car stopped with the same routine efficiency. He stepped out mid-conversation, his phone pressed to his ear, his attention already engaged elsewhere. "No, we'll finalize it today," he said. "I don't want delays." He ended the call as he approached the entrance, handing his phone to his assistant without looking. Then he saw her. Not immediately. His gaze passed over her, once processing the lobby, the movement, the familiar layout. Then returned. Recognition, followed by something else. Irritation. Serenity. He said the word, not quite a question. She didn't move. "I'm here," she replied. Her tone was even, unchanged. Cameron's expression tightened slightly. "What are you doing here?" The question carried more than curiosity. It carried assumption. Serenity met his gaze, entering the building. A pause. Brief, sharp. Cameron stepped closer. This isn't the place for you to just show up unannounced. The words were controlled, measured for the environment, but the edge beneath them was visible. A few employees slowed their pace, not stopping, just enough to observe. Serenity remained still. I didn't realize access required announcement. Cameron exhaled a short release of impatience. You know what I mean. No, she said. I don't. The exchange was quiet, but the space amplified it. Glass carried sound. So did silence. Cameron glanced briefly around, noticing the attention now. Subtle, but present. His voice lowered. Serenity, this isn't appropriate. Based on what? Another pause. This one longer. Because the answer required definition. And definition required justification. Cameron didn't provide one. Instead, he shifted. Come on, he said, stepping forward. Let's not do this here. He reached for the handles of her wheelchair. Not gently, not with the care he'd once shown. With intention, to redirect, to remove. Serenity felt the movement before it completed. The shift in direction. Away from the entrance. Toward the side corridor. She placed her hand lightly on the wheel, stopping it, not forcefully. Just enough. I'm not going that way, she said. Cameron's grip tightened. Serenity. The name was a warning now, a signal. She didn't respond. The moment stretched. Employees had slowed further, not gathering, but no longer pretending not to notice. Security watched from a distance, uncertain, because this was not a situation defined in protocol. This was personal, and personal situations in public spaces create hesitation. Cameron's control began to shift, not fully, but enough. Don't make this difficult, he said. Serenity's voice remained level. I'm not. The words landed without resistance, which made them harder to dismiss. Cameron's jaw tightened. He looked at her not as he once had, but as one looks at an obstacle. Something in the way, something to be moved. And then he did. He stepped behind the chair, pulled. Harder this time. The movement was abrupt. The wheels shifted unevenly against the polished floor. Serenity's body moved with the force. Unbalanced for a fraction of a second, the chair caught, corrected. But the motion had already been seen. He didn't stop. He pulled again, faster, less controlled. The chair angled sharply, one side lifting slightly before settling. A gasp, quiet but audible, came from somewhere behind them. Cameron didn't look. Enough, he said under his breath. You're not staying here. Serenity didn't resist physically. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't call for help. She simply spoke. You should let go. Cameron ignored her. He continued pulling the chair, now halfway turned toward the side exit. And then the wheel caught again. This time against the slight edge of the entry mat. The momentum shifted, the chair jerked, and Serenity moved forward, not falling completely, but enough for the moment to fracture. Cameron released one hand instinctively. Too late. The imbalance had already occurred. Serenity steadied herself, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to regain control. The room had changed. The movement had crossed a line. What had been tension was now visible, defined, witnessed. Cameron stepped back slightly, just enough to create distance. His expression shifted not to regret, but to awareness, of eyes, of attention, of consequence. This is exactly what I meant, he said louder now. You shouldn't be here. The words were for the room, not for her. Serenity adjusted her position in the chair, slowly, deliberately, then looked at him, not with anger, not with accusation, with clarity. I belong here, she said. The sentence was simple, unembellished, but it held, because it did not require agreement. Cameron shook his head. No, he replied, you don't. The denial was immediate, automatic, built on everything he had come to believe, everything he had structured his behavior around. Serenity didn't argue. She didn't repeat herself. She didn't escalate. Instead, she did something else. She reached into her bag. Not quickly, not in a way that suggested urgency. She removed a single envelope, plain, unmarked, placed it on her lap. She didn't open it, didn't hand it to him, just let it exist, between them. Cameron's eyes flicked toward it, briefly, dismissively. "What is that?" he asked. Serenity didn't answer, because the question didn't require one. Not yet. The lobby remained still, not silent, but suspended, waiting for something. Serenity placed her hand lightly over the envelope, then looked back at Cameron. "You should have let go," she said again, not as a warning, as a statement. Cameron exhaled sharply, frustration returning. "I don't have time for this," he said. He turned, not away from her entirely, but enough to signal the end of the exchange, as if the situation could be closed through dismissal. Serenity didn't stop him, didn't call after him, didn't move. She remained where she was, at the entrance, visible, still, and for the first time that morning, not waiting. Because the moment had already passed. What came next would not happen here. Not in the lobby, not in front of glass and witnesses. It would happen where structure mattered, where documents held weight, where words once written could not be undone. Serenity watched Cameron walk away, not with resentment, not with satisfaction, with certainty, because everything he believed in that moment, every assumption, every conclusion, every dismissal was about to be corrected, not by confrontation, not by argument, but by something far more precise and far more final. The email was not sent immediately. Serenity did not move from the lobby after Cameron turned away. She remained where she was positioned, just inside the entrance, the envelope still resting on her lap. Her hand placed lightly over it, as if anchoring something that did not need to be held. Movement resumed around her gradually. Employees returned to their routines, though not with the same ease. Conversations lowered in tone. Glances lingered longer than necessary. The moment they had witnessed did not dissolve. It settled. Serenity allowed it to. Because visibility once established does not need to be reinforced. At 9:14 a.m., she reached for her phone. Not hurried, not concealed. She opened a secure application, separate from anything connected to Blake Technologies. The message had already been prepared the night before. Drafted, reviewed, verified. Now it only required timing. She read it once more. Not for content, for precision. Then she pressed send. The email did not arrive as noise. It arrived as interruption. Inside the executive conference room on the 32nd floor, Cameron had just begun outlining the next phase of expansion. The board members, some present in person, others connected remotely, were following his lead, their attention aligned with the direction he projected. Control in that space was assumed, until it wasn't. The first notification appeared on a screen at the far end of the table. A brief flicker, then another. Phones lit up almost simultaneously. Laptops refreshed. The room didn't stop immediately. It hesitated, a subtle fracture in rhythm. Cameron noticed it. "What is it?" he asked, his tone still steady. No one answered at first, because they were reading, and what they were reading required confirmation before reaction. At the head of the table, Jonathan Reeves, an independent board member known for his measured responses, adjusted his glasses slightly, his gaze fixed on his screen. "Cameron," he said after a moment, "you should take a look at this." There was no urgency in his voice, which made it heavier. Cameron frowned slightly, reaching for his tablet. The email was already open. Subject line: Notice of Majority Ownership and Immediate Governance Adjustment. Sender: Serenity Vale. For a fraction of a second, Cameron didn't process it. Not because he didn't recognize the name, because the context didn't align. He began reading. To the Board of Directors, Blake Technologies effective. Immediately, this message serves as formal notification that controlling interest in Blake Technologies has been consolidated under entities managed by Serenity Vale. Total ownership, 51.3%. All supporting documentation, including transaction records, transfer confirmations, and voting rights alignment, has been filed and is attached herein. In accordance with corporate governance protocols, this change activates a mandatory review of executive leadership and financial conduct. A formal session is to be convened within the hour. Legal counsel will be present. All members are requested to remain available. Serenity Vale. The room did not react all at once. It shifted. Silence first, then movement. Subtle, controlled, but undeniable. Cameron read the message again, slower, as if repetition would alter its meaning. It didn't. He looked up. "That's not possible," he said. The statement was immediate, instinctive. Jonathan didn't respond. He was still reading the attachments. Others followed, scrolling, cross-referencing, conferring. Because the email was not just a claim. It was supported. Documents, filings, signatures, each one aligned, each one verifiable. Cameron's voice sharpened. Where did this come from? No one answered, because the answer was already in front of them. Serenity Vale. The name he had dismissed minutes earlier in the lobby. The name he had removed from conversations. The name he no longer considered part of the structure. Now at the center of it. This has to be a mistake. Cameron continued standing now. We would have seen this. Jonathan looked up. No, he said quietly. Not necessarily. Cameron turned toward him. What does that mean? It means Jonathan replied that if the acquisitions were structured correctly, they wouldn't have triggered immediate visibility. The room absorbed that. Cameron didn't. No, he said again. We monitor shareholder movement, significant movement, another board member added. Individually. Cameron's expression shifted, because the implication was clear. Fragmented acquisition, layered entities. No single transaction large enough to alert, but combined control. He looked back at the screen. At the number, 51.3%, final, unambiguous. This is, he began. But the sentence didn't complete, because there was no language available to reframe it. The authority he had operated under moments earlier was gone. Not challenged, replaced. The room adjusted accordingly. Not dramatically, not immediately, but perceptibly. Posture changed. Attention shifted. Cameron was still standing, still speaking, but the weight of his position had altered. Jonathan closed his tablet. We need to convene the session, he said. As requested. Cameron turned toward him sharply. As requested, he repeated. You're just accepting this. I'm acknowledging it, Jonathan replied. There's a difference. And what if it's invalid? Jonathan held his gaze. Then we'll determine that in session. Cameron's jaw tightened. And until then, Jonathan said, we follow procedure. Procedure. The word settled into the room with quiet authority. Because procedure does not depend on belief. It depends on structure. And the structure had shifted. Cameron looked around the table, at faces he had led, decisions he had shaped, now recalibrating. Not against him, but around a new center. This is ridiculous, he said. But the tone had changed, less certain, more defensive. No one responded, because response would imply debate, and there was nothing to debate. The documentation spoke, clearly, completely. Outside the building, Serenity remained in the lobby. She had not moved. The envelope was still on her lap, unopened, unnecessary. Her phone rested in her hand. No notifications, no responses, because the email was not a conversation. It was a declaration. And declarations once made with evidence do not require reply. At 9:21 a.m., she placed the phone back into her bag, slowly, then adjusted her position slightly. The lobby had returned to motion, but not to normal. There was a difference now, subtle, but present. Information, even when contained, travels. Not through announcements, through behavior. Employees sensed it, not the details, but the shift. And shifts once felt do not go unnoticed. Serenity looked toward the elevators, not expecting Cameron, not waiting for him, only acknowledging the direction in which everything was now moving. Upward, toward the room where structure would be formalized, where evidence would be presented, where control would be redefined. She did not need to be there yet, because she had already arrived, in every way that mattered. The email had done what it was designed to do, not shock, not provoke, but stop, interrupt momentum, force attention, and create a moment where assumption could no longer continue. Inside that moment, everything Cameron believed remained intact was already gone. By the time the formal session convened, the atmosphere inside the executive conference room had settled into something more controlled, though no less heavy. The initial disruption caused by Serenity's email had already passed, replaced by a quieter, more deliberate tension, one that did not rely on raised voices or visible conflict, but on the steady recognition that authority in the room had fundamentally shifted. Cameron remained standing for several minutes after the others had taken their seats, as if the act of sitting would confirm something he was not yet willing to accept. Eventually, he lowered himself into his chair, though his posture remained rigid, his attention fixed not on the people around him, but on the document still open before him. The number had not changed. The structure had not altered itself upon review. Ownership, once verified, did not negotiate. At precisely 9:42 a.m., the door opened. Daniel Mercer entered without hesitation, accompanied by two individuals whose presence required no introduction. Their roles were evident in the way they carried themselves, measured, observant, precise. Legal counsel, but not the kind that explained things in broad language. The kind that presented conclusions supported by evidence that did not invite interpretation. Daniel acknowledged the room with a slight nod before taking a position near the head of the table. Not in Cameron's place, but not deferring to it either. His alignment was clear, though he did not announce it. "Thank you for assembling on short notice," he began, his tone even unhurried. "We will proceed directly." There was no preamble, no attempt to soften what was about to follow, because nothing about the situation required it. Cameron leaned forward slightly, his voice controlled but edged with restrained tension. "Before you begin," he said, "I'd like to clarify the validity of the claim presented in that email." Daniel turned his attention toward him, not dismissive, but not accommodating either. "The validity has already been established through filed documentation and verified transfer records," he replied. "What remains is not confirmation of ownership, but review of conduct under that ownership." The distinction settled heavily in the room. Cameron exhaled through his nose, a subtle release that did not disguise the shift in his position. He did not interrupt again. Daniel placed a folder on the table. Not a single document, but a structured sequence. Organized, indexed, prepared for progression. "We will begin with financial movement," he said. One of the accompanying analysts connected a device to the central display. The screen shifted from the company's internal dashboard to a clean, neutral interface, one designed not for presentation, but for examination. The first chart appeared. Transaction flows, layered, time-stamped. Each movement represented by a line that connected origin to destination, the complexity of the structure revealing itself not through confusion, but through repetition. These transfers originate from Blake Technologies' internal accounts. The analyst explained, his voice steady, detached. They are categorized under various operational expenses, including international consulting and external advisory services. Cameron's eyes followed the lines. He did not speak. However, the analyst continued, when traced beyond the initial classification, these funds do not correspond to legitimate service providers. The screen shifted. Entities appeared. Names, registration details, ownership structures, each one presented without commentary, because the data did not require it. They route through intermediary accounts, the analyst said, before consolidating into a network of shell entities. These entities share overlapping registration agents, synchronized formation timelines, and coordinated transaction patterns. Cameron's hand tightened slightly on the edge of the table. "That doesn't prove misconduct," he said, his voice controlled, though less certain than before. "It could be structured investment." Daniel responded before the analyst could. It could, he said, if the funds returned to the company or were disclosed to the board. A pause. They did not. The next display appeared. A sequence of timelines, overlaying financial movement with internal decision points, board approvals, budget reallocations, strategic announcements. Each transfer aligned not randomly, but precisely following moments when authority had been exercised. These transactions occur consistently within narrow windows, following executive-level decisions, the analyst explained. The pattern indicates intentional alignment. Cameron leaned back slightly as if distance might alter the clarity of what he was seeing. That's circumstantial, he said. Daniel inclined his head slightly. Then we will continue. The screen shifted again. This time, the data narrowed, focused, from broad movement to specific endpoints, accounts, assets, acquisitions. Funds consolidated through the previously identified entities were redirected into private investment structures, the analyst said. These include real estate holdings, equity positions, and financial instruments that do not appear on Blake Technologies' balance sheet. The final layer appeared. Ownership linkage, indirect, but traceable. Names did not appear directly. They didn't need to, because the structure revealed benefit, and benefit, when aligned consistently, defined intent. These assets, the analyst concluded, are tied to individuals with executive authority within Blake Technologies. The room did not react immediately, because the conclusion had already been forming. Now it was simply visible. Cameron's voice, when it came, was quieter. You're making assumptions. Daniel met his gaze. No, he said. We are presenting verified connections. He gestured slightly toward the documents. You will have access to all supporting material. Cameron looked around the table, at the board members, at the faces that no longer reflected alignment, not hostility, but recalibration. One of them, Elena Ruiz, a long-standing investor, spoke for the first time. Is there any explanation for these transfers that has been disclosed to the board? The question was not directed at Daniel. It was directed at Cameron. He hesitated. Not long, but long enough. No, he said. The word settled, not as admission, but as absence. Elena nodded once. Then we proceed accordingly. Daniel closed the folder, not because the presentation was complete, but because the essential structure had been established. There is additional material, he said. Communications, recorded conversations, internal correspondence. All of it aligns with the financial structure presented. He did not display them. He did not need to, because the foundation had already been laid. Further detail would not change direction, only reinforce it. Cameron remained still. For the first time since the session began, he did not speak, not because he had nothing to say, because he understood that what he said would not alter what had been shown. Across the room, the balance had shifted entirely, not through force, not through argument, through evidence. Structured, sequenced, unavoidable. Daniel allowed a moment of silence, not to create effect, but to let the information settle without interruption. Then he spoke again. The board will now determine the appropriate course of action under governance protocol. There was no emphasis, no pressure, because the outcome did not depend on persuasion, only on procedure. Cameron lowered his gaze to the table. The documents remained in front of him, unchanged, unmovable. For the first time, he did not attempt to reinterpret them, because reinterpretation required uncertainty, and there was none left. What had been hidden was now structured. What had been assumed was now corrected, and what had been controlled was no longer his. The room did not descend into chaos. There were no raised voices, no abrupt accusations, no visible unraveling of composure. What replaced Cameron's authority was not confrontation, but procedure measured deliberate and far more final than any argument could have been. After Daniel Mercer concluded the presentation, the board did not respond immediately. They did not need to. Each member had already begun reviewing the documents, independently scrolling through attachments, verifying timestamps, cross-referencing figures with internal reports they had previously approved without question. The silence that followed was not empty. It was active. Cameron remained seated, his posture no longer rigid, but held in place by something less visible recognition, not yet fully expressed, but no longer avoidable. His attention moved across the table, searching not for agreement, but for resistance. He did not find it. Jonathan Reeves was the first to speak again, his tone unchanged from earlier, though now carrying a different weight. "We will proceed with formal review under Section 4.2 of Governance Protocol," he said. "This includes immediate evaluation of executive conduct and fiduciary responsibility." The language was precise, not emotional, because the situation no longer required interpretation. Cameron leaned forward, his voice controlled but sharpened by urgency. "This is premature," he said. "You're acting on a single presentation, without full context." Jonathan did not look at him immediately. Instead, he closed the tablet in front of him, aligning it carefully with the edge of the table before responding. "This is not a single presentation," he said. "It is a structured body of evidence." Cameron exhaled the sound, restrained but audible. "And you're accepting it without challenge." Jonathan met his gaze. "We are reviewing it," he said. "That is the process." Cameron's hand moved slightly as if to gesture, then stopped. "Then I want time," he said. "Time to respond, to provide explanation." "You will have that opportunity," Daniel said evenly, "within the appropriate legal framework." Cameron turned toward him, which is what exactly. Daniel did not raise his voice. "A formal proceeding," he replied. "Not this session." The distinction was clear. This was not the place for defense. This was the place for determination. Elena Ruiz spoke again, her tone steady, unhurried. "Before we proceed further," she said, "I would like to address leadership continuity." The shift in focus was subtle, but decisive. Cameron looked at her, something in his expression tightening. "What about it?" Elena folded her hands lightly on the table. "Given the evidence presented and the confirmed change in ownership, it is necessary to consider interim leadership." The word interim did not soften the implication. It defined it. Cameron's response came quickly. "You're talking about removing me." Elena did not respond immediately. She did not need to. The structure of the conversation had already answered the question. Jonathan spoke instead. "We are discussing suspension of executive authority pending formal review." The phrasing was careful, legally precise, but its meaning was clear. Cameron stood. Not abruptly, but with intention. "That's not justified," he said. "Not based on this." No one raised their voice in response. No one argued, because argument would imply uncertainty. And uncertainty had already been resolved. Daniel opened another document. "This is the provision," he said, placing it on the table. "It allows for immediate suspension when credible evidence of financial misconduct is presented and verified." Cameron did not look at the document. He didn't need to. He understood. "This is overreach," he said. Jonathan's expression remained neutral. "It is protocol." The word settled again. Protocol, structure, process. Each one reinforcing the same conclusion. Cameron's gaze moved across the room once more. This time slower, more deliberate. He was not searching for support anymore. He was measuring absence. No one spoke in his defense. Not because they had turned against him, because the situation no longer allowed for alignment based on loyalty. Only on evidence. After a moment, Cameron sat down again. Not in resignation, in recognition. The board proceeded, not dramatically, not with visible momentum, but step by step. A motion was introduced, formal, documented. Jonathan read it aloud. "Motion to suspend Cameron Blake from the position of Chief Executive Officer of Blake Technologies, effective immediately pending formal legal review of fiduciary conduct." No one interrupted. No one objected. Elena seconded the motion. The room acknowledged it. Then came the vote. Not secret, not delayed. Each member responded in turn. Yes, the first yes. The second. One by one, consistent, measured, unanimous. Cameron did not speak during the vote. He remained still, his attention fixed forward, as if the outcome might alter itself if not directly engaged. It did not. When the final confirmation was given, Jonathan closed the process with a simple statement. The motion carries. No emphasis, no conclusion beyond that. Because nothing more was required. The decision existed. Cameron exhaled slowly. For the first time, the tension in his posture shifted, not outwardly, but internally, as if something he had been holding in place no longer had structure to support it. This isn't finished, he said. Daniel inclined his head slightly. No, he replied. It isn't. The agreement was not concession. It was acknowledgement, because what followed would extend beyond the room. Legal review, regulatory involvement, potential consequences that did not resolve through internal decisions. But for now, the structure had changed. Immediately, irrevocably. Jonathan turned slightly toward the far end of the table. We will appoint interim leadership until a permanent decision is made, he said. He did not look at Cameron when he spoke, because the role no longer belonged to him. Elena Jonathan continued. You will coordinate with the executive team to ensure continuity. She nodded once. It will be done. The conversation moved forward, not around Cameron, past him. Operational steps, communication strategy, internal messaging, each decision aligned with a new structure, each one reinforcing it. Cameron remained in the room, but no longer within the center of it. His presence had shifted, from authority to subject, from decision-maker to outcome. He did not interrupt, because interruption would not change direction. Across the city, Serenity did not attend the session. She did not need to, because everything that mattered had already been set in motion. Her phone remained silent. No updates, no confirmations, because confirmation was no longer necessary. The process, once initiated, followed its own structure, and that structure did not require her presence to continue. In the conference room, the meeting concluded without ceremony. Documents were collected, next steps outlined, responsibilities reassigned. No one lingered, because there was nothing left to discuss in that space. Cameron stood last, not out of defiance, but because he had nowhere immediate to go. The room, once defined by his direction, no longer responded to him. He looked once more at the table, at the place he had occupied, at the structure he had built, now removed from his control, not taken, reassigned, through a process, through evidence, through a system he had believed he understood, but had not accounted for completely. As he turned toward the door, there was no one waiting for him. No acknowledgement, no confrontation, just absence. And in that absence, the reality settled. Not loudly, not visibly, but fully. What had been his was no longer. By the time the formal decisions had been executed and internal communication began to circulate, the building itself seemed unchanged. Elevators continued their steady rhythm. Employees moved between floors with the same quiet urgency, and meetings resumed under revised agendas that did not yet fully reflect what had taken place. From the outside, Blake Technologies remained what it had always appeared to be: structured, efficient, controlled. Inside, however, the center had shifted. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but completely. The announcement was distributed at 11:08 a.m., drafted by legal counsel, sent and reviewed by the board before release. It was concise, carefully worded, and free of speculation. Effective immediately, Cameron Blake has been suspended from his role as Chief Executive Officer pending formal review under corporate governance protocols. Interim leadership will be established to ensure operational continuity. There was no mention of misconduct, no elaboration, no reference to Serenity. Because at this stage, disclosure was not required. Only alignment. The message moved through internal systems, quickly appearing on screens, devices, and inboxes across the company. Employees read it once, then again, as if repetition might clarify something left unsaid. Whispers followed. Not loud, not disruptive, but present. Because information, even when limited, generates interpretation. Some tried to reconcile it with what they knew of Cameron's leadership, his confidence, his visibility, his control. Others connected it to the subtle changes they had noticed over time, though they had never named them directly. And then there were those who remembered, who had been present before the company became what it was now, who had seen Serenity in rooms where decisions were first shaped. Their silence carried a different weight. Serenity remained where she had been for most of the morning, not in the conference room, not within the executive floor, but in the lobby where everything had begun. By the time the announcement reached her, she did not check her phone. She already knew, not because she had been informed, because the structure she had set in motion had reached its natural conclusion. Around her, movement continued. Employees passed through the space with more awareness than before. Some glanced at her longer, now recognition, sharpening into understanding that did not yet have language. Security remained at their posts, though their posture had shifted subtly from passive observation to quiet attentiveness. Serenity did not engage. She did not acknowledge the change in atmosphere. She remained still, saw her hands resting lightly on the arms of her chair, her gaze directed toward the glass doors through which Cameron had entered earlier that morning. The same doors, the same space, only the structure behind it had changed. At 11:23 a.m., Jonathan Reeves exited the elevator and moved across the lobby toward her. His pace was unhurried, his expression neutral, but his direction was clear. He stopped a few steps in front of her. "Serenity," he said. She looked up. "Jonathan." There was a brief pause. Not uncertain, just unfilled. "The board has completed its initial review," he said. "Interim leadership is being established." Serenity inclined her head slightly. "I expected as much." Jonathan studied her for a moment, not evaluating, acknowledging. "There will be further proceedings," he added. "Legal, regulatory. This is only the beginning." "Yes," she said. He hesitated briefly. "If you intend to take an active role, I don't," Serenity said. The response came without hesitation. Jonathan nodded, once accepting it. "Then we will proceed accordingly." Another pause. Shorter this time. "If you require anything," he said, "you have access." Serenity's gaze remained steady. "I won't." Jonathan did not press further, because he understood what she meant. Access in her case was not a matter of permission. It had already been established. He inclined his head slightly, then stepped back. The interaction ended without formality, without conclusion, because none was necessary. Serenity remained in place for a few moments after he left, not waiting, not reflecting, simply allowing the moment to settle into its final form. Then she moved, not toward the elevators, not toward the executive floor, toward the exit, the same path she had taken when she entered, measured, deliberate, unhurried. As she crossed the lobby, a few employees stepped aside, creating space without being asked. Some lowered their gaze. Others held it for a moment longer than before. Recognition had shifted, not into admiration, not into judgment, into awareness. Serenity did not respond to any of it, because none of it required response. At the doors, the security guard nearest the entrance hesitated briefly, then stepped forward to assist. "Ma'am," he said, opening the door. Serenity nodded once. "Thank you." She passed through without pause. Outside, the city continued as it always had. Traffic moved, voices carried. Nothing in the environment reflected what had just occurred within the building behind her. And that was as it should be, because not all changes required visible acknowledgement. Her car was already waiting. The driver stepped out, positioning the door, aligning the space with practiced precision. Serenity entered without assistance beyond what was necessary. No hesitation, no adjustment, just continuation. As the door closed, the building remained in view through the tinted glass. Blake Technologies, still standing, still functioning. But no longer under the control it had known. Serenity did not look back for long, only enough to confirm what had already been established. Then she turned her gaze forward. The car pulled into traffic, merged, disappeared into the flow of the city. Behind her, the company would continue. Restructured, reevaluated, realigned. Cameron would face what followed, not in public spectacle, but within systems designed to process what had been revealed. Serenity would not be part of that, not because she was removed, because she chose not to remain. Control, once established, did not require presence, only decision, and her decision was clear. She had not acted to reclaim space, she had acted to correct structure. Now that it was corrected, there was nothing left for her to take, nothing left to prove, nothing left to say. The exit, like everything else, was quiet, not because it lacked meaning, because it no longer needed to declare it. In the weeks that followed, there were no headlines large enough to capture what had actually happened. Blake Technologies did not collapse. It did not fracture publicly, nor did it become a spectacle of scandal in the way such events are often expected to unfold. The company continued operating its systems intact, its team still aligned under the structure that had been quietly redefined. From the outside, it appeared as though leadership had simply transitioned another adjustment in a corporate landscape accustomed to change. But beneath that surface, the consequences moved with a different kind of gravity. Cameron Blake was no longer part of the building. His access had been revoked within hours of the board's decision. Not ceremonially, not with confrontation, but through systems that did not require acknowledgement to enforce themselves. His credentials stopped functioning. His accounts were suspended. His authority, once assumed in every room he entered, no longer extended beyond what had already been documented. Legal proceedings began shortly after, not announced immediately, but initiated with the same precision that had defined everything leading up to them. Regulatory bodies were notified. Financial records were submitted. External investigators operating independently of the company began reviewing the structure that had been uncovered. Cameron retained counsel, experienced, strategic. But the framework he faced was not one built on accusation alone. It was constructed on alignment, records, timelines, transactions, communications, each reinforcing the same conclusion from multiple directions. There were no dramatic denials, no public statements attempting to reclaim narrative. Because narrative, in this case, did not determine outcome. Structure did. Vanessa Cross disappeared from the company within days. Her departure was framed as resignation, brief, unelaborated. She did not issue a statement. She did not respond to inquiries. Her presence, once integrated into the company's public identity, receded without resistance. Because there was nothing to defend, only association. And association, once documented, carries its own weight. Within Blake Technologies, the transition continued. Jonathan Reeves oversaw the interim structure with the same measured approach he had brought to the board. He did not attempt to redefine the company's direction immediately. Instead, he stabilized it, reviewing internal processes, reinforcing compliance, ensuring that the systems now in place aligned with the ownership that had been established. A new chief executive officer was appointed within a month. Jonathan Reeves himself did not take the role permanently. Instead, the board selected Eleanor Whitaker, a restructuring specialist known for restoring institutional integrity without unnecessary disruption. Her presence did not draw attention. It did not need to. She adjusted what required adjustment, left intact what remained functional, and removed what no longer aligned with the structure that had been revealed. Employees adapted, as they always do. Questions faded, not because they had been fully answered, because the environment no longer sustained them. And over time, the absence of disruption became its own form of resolution. Serenity did not return, not to the office, not to the boardroom, not to any space where her presence would have been recognized as authority. Her ownership remained, documented, absolute. But she did not exercise it visibly. She attended no meetings, issued no directives, requested no recognition, because her role had never depended on visibility. It had always been structural, and that structure was now complete. She relocated quietly, not far, but enough. A different residence, a different routine, a life that did not intersect with the daily operations of the company she now controlled. Her days were not empty. They were intentional. She reconnected with work she had set aside years earlier, not because she needed to prove capability, but because it remained part of who she was before everything else had been defined by proximity to Cameron. She reviewed investments, advised selectively, maintained connections within the financial networks that had always recognized her name, even when it had not been publicly attached to outcomes. There was no announcement, no reintroduction, because she had never truly left, only stepped out of view. Occasionally, Daniel Mercer would update her. Brief summaries, progress on legal proceedings, regulatory developments, each one delivered without emphasis, because by then the outcome was no longer uncertain. One afternoon, months later, he called with a simple update. "It's concluding," he said. Serenity sat near the window, the light falling across the table beside her. "I assumed it would," she replied. "There will be formal consequences," he added. "Financial, legal." Serenity did not ask for detail, because detail no longer mattered. "Thank you," she said. Daniel paused briefly. "You handled this." "Precisely." Serenity's expression did not change. "It was already there," she said. "I only followed it." He understood, because what had happened was not an act of creation. It was an act of recognition. The structure Cameron had built had always contained its own outcome. Serenity had simply seen it clearly enough to respond. After the call ended, she remained where she was. The room was quiet, not empty, just still. Outside, the world moved as it always did. Unaware, unaffected, because not all consequences require public acknowledgement to exist. There were no final confrontations, no moments where Cameron stood before her to ask for explanation or offer apology. No exchange of words designed to close what had already ended. Their last interaction remained what it had been. Moment in a lobby. A hand that did not let go when it should have. A statement made without understanding its context. Serenity did not revisit it, not because it lacked significance, because it no longer required interpretation. What remained was not the event, but the structure that followed it. The correction, the alignment, the quiet restoration of something that had been shifted out of place. She did not feel satisfaction, not in the way others might expect. There was no sense of victory, no desire to revisit what had been taken or lost, because nothing had been reclaimed through force. It had been clarified. And clarity once established does not demand recognition. It simply exists. In time, the story would fade from those who had witnessed fragments of it. Employees would move on. The company would continue. Cameron's name would become associated with something defined in legal terms rather than personal ones. Vanessa's would disappear entirely. But Serenity's would remain where it had always been, not in headlines, not in narratives shaped for public consumption, but within the structure itself. Ownership, control, defined not by presence, but by foundation. And in that foundation, there was no need for noise, no need for defense, no need for anything beyond what had already been established. Because the most complete form of power is the one that does not need to be seen. In the end, what stays with us is rarely the moment of confrontation, but the quiet choices that shape everything afterward. Serenity never raised her voice, never demanded recognition, never turned her pain into spectacle. She observed, understood, and acted with precision when the time was right. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to reflect on where strength truly comes from. Sometimes it isn't loud. Sometimes it's patient, quiet, and unshakably certain. If you're watching this from somewhere in the world right now, I'd be curious to know where and what time it is for you. Stories like this travel far, but they land differently depending on where we stand. And if you find meaning in stories where dignity leads and justice unfolds without noise, you're welcome to stay. There's more ahead.